Welcome to Kat Has Questions, curiosity, stories, and the strange corners of everyday life. Hello. I'm your host, Kat. Okay, guys, today I have a very special episode for you. I am actually going to be joined by AC Roberts from The Wanted Files. She's got a great podcast all about true crime, so if you need more, go check out her show. And with that, let's dive into today's case.
In the early 1970s, 3 young girls disappeared in and around Rochester, New York. Each case on its own was devastating. A child leaving home for a simple errand and never coming back.
But over time, something else began to take shape. A pattern. Not just in how the girls were taken or where they're found, but in something far more specific. Something that, once people noticed it, was hard to unsee. And that's where this case becomes complicated.
Patterns can be meaningful. They can help investigators connect cases, identify behavior, and narrow a field of possibility. But they can also be misleading.
In this episode, we're going to walk through what is known about these 3 cases, what's been confirmed, what's been reported, and what remains uncertain. We're also going to look at the role that pattern recognition plays in cases like this. So, before the name, before the pattern, there were 3 girls. Carmen Colon, who was 10 years old, Wanda Walkowicz, who was 11, Michelle Maenza, who is also 11. All 3 lived in the Rochester, New York area. All 3 were taken during the day in broad daylight, in plain sight, not in isolation or in secrecy, but in the moments that, at the time, would have felt completely routine. Nothing about these situations initially suggested something extreme, which is part of what makes what happened next harder to process. It starts in 1971, on November 16th. 10-year-old Carmen Colon leaves her home on foot to run a simple errand to a local pharmacy that her grandmother had instructed her to visit on the West Main Street on Rochester. She is expected back shortly, and when she doesn't return, concern begins to build. Not immediately panic, but enough to notice something is off. Because this should have been a short trip, the kind of thing a child her age had likely done before. According to eyewitnesses, Colon entered the pharmacy but left the store upon learning the prescription she had been instructed to collect for her grandmother had not been processed yet. She exited the store around 4:20 p.m., and she was then observed entering a car parked close to the pharmacy. Colon was reported missing to the Rochester police at 7:50 p.m. when she did not return home. This next part is chilling, and this was learned later by police, but approximately 50 minutes after Carmen exited the pharmacy, motorists driving along a nearby Interstate 490, observed a child, who is now believed to have been Carmen, naked from the waist down, running from a reversing vehicle believed to be a dark-colored Ford Pinto hatchback, frantically waving her arms and shouting in an attempt to flag down a passing vehicle. At least one of these witnesses observed Carmen being submissively led back to this vehicle by her abductor. So the first question becomes a simple one. Where is she? Search efforts begin, and then Carmen is found. 2 days later, 2 teenage boys discovered Carmen's partially nude body in a gully not far from Interstate 490. This location was approximately 12 miles from where Carmen had last been seen alive. This was in the village of Churchville. Her coat was discovered in a culvert some 300 feet away from her body. Her trousers were later discovered on November 30th, close to the service road near where those motorists had potentially observed her trying to escape her abductor. An autopsy revealed that Carmen's attack was brutal. In addition to having been raped, the child had suffered a fracture to her skull and one of her vertebrae before she had been manually strangled to death. Furthermore, her body had been extensively scratched by fingernails. Both the murder of Carmen and the fact that no individual who had observed the child attempting to flee from her abductor had attempted to offer any help generated intense public outrage. Her body being discovered in a different town is the first shift, because now this is no longer a missing child's case. It is something else entirely. At this point, there's no pattern, Just a tragedy, a single case, something terrible but isolated. Or at least, that's how it appears at first. 17 months later, at approximately 5 p.m., on April 2nd, 1973, 11-year-old Wanda Walkowicz disappeared from the east side of Rochester. She, too, was taking a short trip to run an errand and never made it home. Something once again routine and normal. According to the owner of the store where Wanda had been instructed to visit, the child had purchased the groceries at approximately 5:15 and then began walking alone down Conkey Avenue. She was reported missing by her mother, Joyce, at 8 p.m., and that night, she never made it back home. Now, there's something familiar about this, but still, no official connection. Not yet. Because cases like this, on their own, are already complex, and linking them requires more than similarity and certainty. Police immediately launched an intense search to locate Wanda. Almost 50 detectives searched several square miles of the terrain around her home, the store, and areas around a river where she had been known to play. These searches failed to locate the child, although several neighborhood residents recalled observing Wanda struggling to carry the bag of groceries. 3 classmates specifically observed her bracing the bag against a fence so that she could improve her grip as a brown vehicle drove past her. Another eyewitness reportedly observed a child standing alongside the passenger door of a large brown vehicle, conversing with the driver. The location of this sighting was just 0.2 of a mile from the Walkowicz home. Another individual reported witnessing a man forcing a girl matching Wanda's description into a light-colored Dodge Dart on Conkey Avenue between 5:30 and 6 o'clock p.m. on the night of her disappearance. Wanda's body was found by a police officer at 10:15 a.m. the following day at the base of a hillside along an access road to State Route 104 in Webster, approximately 7 miles from Rochester. So also in a different town outside of Rochester. The position of her body indicated she had likely been thrown from a moving vehicle, and then her body rolled down the embankment. She was found fully clothed. However, an autopsy revealed she had been sexually assaulted and then strangled with a ligature, most likely a belt. She had several defensive wounds indicating Wanda had fought her attacker hard. In addition, her body had been redressed after death. The autopsy also revealed traces of semen, pubic hair, as well as white cat fur on her clothing, although the Walkowicz family did not own a pet with fur of this color. At this point, the Rochester Police Department dismissed any suggestion of a link between the murders of Carmen and Wanda. But now there are 2 cases. 2 girls, 2 disappearances, 2 recoveries, with similarities that are noticeable, but still not definitive. And this is where something subtle begins to happen. Because when 2 events share certain traits, the human instinct is to connect them, even if the connection isn't fully understood. So the question shifts slightly. Are these related? Or are we starting to see something that isn't actually there? Later that same year, in 1973, a 3rd girl, Michelle Maenza. It was 7 months later, on the evening of November 26, 1973, 11-year-old Michelle was reported missing by her mother, Carolyn, after she failed to return home from school. Subsequent investigations would determine Maenza was last seen by her classmates at approximately 3:20 p.m., walking alone en route to a shopping plaza located close to her school, with the intention of retrieving a purse her mother had left inside a store within the plaza earlier that day. Approximately 10 minutes later, a witness observed Maenza sitting in the passenger seat of a beige or tan vehicle traveling at high speed on Ackerman Street before turning onto Webster Avenue. According to this witness, she had been crying. Later that evening, at 5:30 p.m. on the 26th, a motorist observed a man standing by a large beige or tan vehicle with a flat tire, parked alongside Route 350, in the town of Walworth, holding a girl he strongly believed to be Michelle by the wrist. When this motorist had stopped to offer assistance, the individual had deliberately grabbed the girl and pushed her behind his back. Also, blocked his license plate from the motorist as he stared in his direction with such a menacing expression on his face that the other driver felt compelled to drive away. Michelle's fully clothed body was discovered at 10:30 a.m. on November 28th, lying face down in a ditch alongside a rural road in Macedon, approximately 15 miles from Rochester. Her autopsy revealed that in addition to receiving extensive blunt force trauma to her body, Michelle had been raped and then strangled to death from behind with a ligature, possibly a thin rope. There were numerous strands of white cat fur discovered upon her clothing and leaf samples matching the foliage where her body was discovered. Investigators were able to retrieve a partial palm print from her neck and traces of semen on her body in underwear. A variation from the previous attacks, an analysis of the contents of Michelle's stomach revealed traces of a hamburger and onions which had been consumed approximately 1 hour before her murder, giving credence to earlier reports of a girl matching Michelle's description, having been seen in the company of a white man with dark hair, aged between 25 and 35, approximately 6 feet tall. They were reportedly seen together at a fast food restaurant in the town of Penfield at approximately 4:30 p.m. on the afternoon of her disappearance. At this point, the repetition is harder to ignore. Not because of anything that had been officially confirmed, but because the structure of these events is starting to look familiar. 3 girls, similar ages and similar circumstances, and when Michelle is found, that's when the pattern begins to take shape in a way that feels intentional. Whether it is or not, that's a separate question. But now people are looking, comparing, and lining things up. So this is where the case changes. Each girl shares the same first and last initial. Carmen Colon, Wanda Walkowicz, Michelle Maenza. And each of their bodies is found in a town with a matching initial. This is how the murders of these innocent girls were labeled the Alphabet Murders, or it's also known as the double initial murders. At face value, that feels deliberate. And once that idea enters the conversation, it becomes difficult to ignore. Because patterns feel meaningful. They feel like clues and intention. But here's the problem. A pattern is not the same thing as proof. And that's the tension at the center of this case. Because the pattern could mean one single calculating offender, someone intentionally constructing a signature, or it could be something else, even coincidental. And without clear evidence confirming one over the other, both possibilities exist at the same time, which complicates everything. If you strip everything else away, the pattern, the speculation, the theories, what remains are the last known moments. Each girl leaving home, each one stepping into something familiar, a route they likely trusted, a distance that felt manageable. And in each case, something interrupts that normalcy. Quickly, quietly, without explanation. There's no clear moment where everything visibly changes. No confirmed point of escalation, just a gap between where they were last seen and where they were later found. And that gap is where the uncertainty lives. Now, investigators and the public aren't just asking what happened. They're asking, what does this pattern mean?
After each of these disappearances, the response followed a familiar pattern. Search efforts began quickly. Families, neighbors, and law enforcement canvassed the surrounding areas, retracing last known movements, checking routes the girls were supposed to take, and following up on any reported sightings. Then the tips came in, some from people who believed they'd seen something, others from individuals trying to make sense of what happened after the fact. Like most high-profile cases involving children, the volume of information grew quickly, and not all of it was reliable. This created a second challenge. Not just finding answers, but sorting through the noise. As the cases began to be investigated together, the investigative approach began to change. This wasn't just 3 separate incidents anymore, it was potentially a pattern. And once that possibility entered the investigation, it influenced everything else, including how leads were prioritized, how information was shared, and how the public was brought into the process. Public messaging became a central part of the strategy. Billboards were put up, rewards were offered, law enforcement made efforts to keep the case visible, not just locally, but across a wider area. The goal was simple: keep the cases in front of as many people as possible in the hopes that someone somewhere would recognize something. And that kind of visibility can be powerful, but it also comes with trade-offs. This is because the more a case is shared publicly, the more interpretation enters the picture, not just from investigators, but from the community, the media, and anyone trying to connect the dots. And in this case, there was a major question at the center of that interpretation. Were these 3 cases connected? Investigators and writers have differed on that point. Some have pointed to the similarities, the timing, the location, the circumstances, and argued that the pattern is too consistent to ignore. Others have cautioned that patterns, especially ones based on names and locations, can emerge in ways that feel meaningful without being intentional. And without a confirmed suspect or a definitive forensic link across all three cases, that question has never been fully resolved, which leaves the investigation in a very difficult position. Because when a case may be connected but isn't definitively proven to be, every decision becomes a little more complicated. And that complexity becomes even clearer when you look at the evidence itself and how it has and hasn't been preserved over time. Now, when these cases were first investigated in the early 1970s, the tools available to law enforcement were very limited compared to what exists today. Forensic science was still developing. DNA analysis, as we understand it now, was non-existent. Investigators relied heavily on physical evidence, witness statements, and patterns they could observe at the scene. That meant evidence had to be interpreted differently. What could be collected, preserved, and tested was constrained by the technology of the time. And in cases like this, where the crime scenes were outdoors and exposed, that challenge became even more significant. Over time, as forensic science advanced, there was hope that these cases could be revisited with new tools. But that's where it becomes especially difficult. For two of the victims, biological evidence that might have been tested using modern DNA methods was destroyed before those methods were widely available. That decision wasn't unusual for the time. Evidence retention policies were much different, and many departments didn't anticipate the future value of DNA testing. Still, the result is the same. Opportunities that might exist today might not exist in the future. One case is different, though. In the case of Wanda Walkowicz, biological evidence was preserved and still exists. That evidence has been re-examined in recent years using modern forensic techniques, with the goal of identifying a suspect or comparing a link between the cases. But even with that advancement, there are limitations. DNA can confirm presence, it can exclude individuals, and it can sometimes identify a suspect. But it doesn't always answer the larger question, especially in cases where evidence is incomplete, degraded, or not clearly connected across multiple incidents. And that's where the reality of investigation becomes clear. The technology has improved, but the evidence has not. In other words, forensic science moves forward, but these cases remain tied in part to limitations of the time which they were investigated.
Up to this point, the investigation is focused on what can be confirmed: timelines, locations, the physical evidence that does exist. But investigations don't stay in that space for long. Because once the immediate facts are established, the question naturally shifts. Not just what happened, but who could have done it. And in a case like this, where a pattern seems to exist, the question becomes even more complicated. Because now, investigators aren't just looking for a suspect. They're looking for someone who fits an idea. In the case of Carmen Colon, her uncle, Miguel Colon, is considered by investigators to be a strong suspect in her murder. Miguel was her paternal uncle. Following the separation of Colon's parents, he had formed a relationship with her mother, Guillermina. Typically on occasions that Colon had walked to the pharmacy to collect family prescriptions, she had been accompanied by her grandfather, Felix. Although, on the date of her disappearance, Colon had pleaded with her grandparents to be allowed to walk to the pharmacy unaccompanied. Just weeks prior to Colon's abduction and murder, her uncle is known to have purchased a car closely matching the vehicle seen by eyewitnesses, reversing upon Interstate 490 in pursuit of the child. Investigators did conduct a search of this vehicle shortly after Colon's murder, discovering the interior and exterior of the car had been extensively cleaned, and the trunk had been washed with a strong cleaning solution. Questioning of the dealership, which had recently sold the vehicle to Miguel, revealed the trunk had not been washed with a detergent prior to the sale. Moreover, a doll belonging to the child was found in his car, although Colon's relatives informed investigators she had frequently traveled in Miguel's vehicle and may have left the toy in his car at any point. Furthermore, according to a friend, 2 days after the death of his niece, Miguel had informed him of his intention to leave the country, as he had, quote, done something wrong in Rochester. He relocated from Rochester to Puerto Rico just 4 days after the murder of his niece. Investigators did travel to San Juan to question Miguel in March 1972. Although local newspapers published articles detailing police intentions to question him, resulting in Miguel fleeing from authorities. Miguel surrendered to authorities on March 26th and agreed to be extradited back to Rochester to face questioning. Michelle Colon was unable to provide a credible alibi for his movements on the date of his niece's murder, and no individual could be located to corroborate his claims regarding his whereabouts. Despite strong circumstantial evidence attesting to Miguel's guilt, no physical evidence was located at the crime scene or within his vehicle to link him to the murder. Michelle Colon died by suicide in 1991 at the age of 44, following an incident of domestic violence in which he shot and wounded both his wife and his brother. Another individual considered a strong suspect in the Alphabet murders is a 25-year-old Rochester firefighter named Dennis Termini. Termini was a prolific serial offender known as the Garage Rapist, who is known to have committed a minimum of 14 rapes of teenage girls and young women between 1971 and 1973. He is also known to have owned a beige vehicle, similar in description to the vehicle observed by many eyewitnesses to the abductions. He lived at an address close to the area where Michelle Maenza was last seen alive. 5 weeks after the death of the final victim of the Alphabet murders, on January 1st, 1974, Termini attempted to abduct a teenage girl at gunpoint, although he fled the scene when the teenager refused to stop screaming. Shortly thereafter, he abducted another potential victim, although on this occasion he was pursued by police, culminating in Termini committing suicide by shooting himself in the head. A subsequent forensic examination of Termini's vehicle did reveal traces of white cat fur on the upholstery. In January 2007, Termini's body was exhumed to obtain a DNA sample for comparison with the semen samples recovered from Walkowicz's body. The results of this test confirmed Termini was not responsible for her murder. However, no physical evidence retrieved from the bodies of Colon or Maenza exists to compare with Termini's DNA. Another suspect in the Alphabet murders is serial killer Kenneth Bianchi, who at the time of the murders worked as an ice cream vendor in Rochester. He is known to have worked at locations close to the first two murder scenes. Bianchi had relocated from Rochester to Los Angeles in January 1976. Between 1977 and 1978, he and his cousin Angelo Buono Jr. committed the Hillside Strangler murders of 10 girls and young women between the ages of 12 and 28. Bianchi was never charged with the Alphabet murders and has vehemently denied any culpability in the homicides. He has repeatedly attempted to have investigators officially clear him of suspicion. However, while residing in Rochester, he is known to have driven a vehicle of the same color and model as the vehicle seen near one of the abduction sites. Finally, the last viable suspect currently. In April 2011, a 77-year-old named Joseph Nasso was arrested in Reno, Nevada, for the murders of 4 women in California committed between 1977 and 1994, all of whom are believed to have been sex workers, and each of whose surname begin with the same letter as that of her last name. Nasso was a New York native who had lived in Rochester during the early 1970s, and who is known to have regularly traveled between New York and California. Initially described by authorities as a person of interest in the Alphabet murders, DNA testing has confirmed Nasso's DNA is not a match to the semen samples recovered from the body of Wanda Walkowicz. Nasso was brought to trial on June 18, 2013, charged with the murders of the 4 California victims. He was convicted of each murder on August 20th. On November 22nd of 2013, Nasso was formally sentenced to death. None of the suspects I discussed fully account for everything. Not the timing, not the locations, not the pattern itself. And when that happens, when there isn't a clear answer, the uncertainty doesn't just disappear. It gets redirected into how we interpret what we are seeing.
When forensic psychology looks at a case like this, the starting point isn't identity, it's behavior. What was done, how it was done, and what that combination tends to mean in a broader context. Now, across these cases, there are several consistent elements. Young victims taken during the day, relatively close to home, with evidence of sexual assault and death by strangulation. This combination tells us a few things. First, we'll go over the victim profile. These were children, targeted in a familiar environment. That typically points to an offender who is comfortable operating in spaces that feel safe to the victim. Neighborhoods, routine routes, places where a child wouldn't immediately perceive danger. It can also suggest an offender who understands those routines, whether through direct observation or familiarity with the area. Second is the method. Strangulation is a close contact act. It requires physical proximity, sustained control, and a certain amount of strength. In forensic psychology, it's often associated with offenses that are personal in nature, not necessarily because the victim is known to the offender, but because the act itself involves domination, control, and time. This distinguishes it from more impulsive or distant methods. It suggests the offender was willing to engage directly and maintain that control long enough to complete the act, which brings us to our third aspect, timing. These abductions occurred during the day, often when victims were running errands or moving through routine spaces. That carries risk. As I mentioned, this suggests confidence, familiarity, or both. Offenders who operate in daylight in residential areas are typically not acting at random in the moment. There is often some level of selection, even if it isn't visible from the outside. In each of these cases, the victims were left in locations that were accessible, not deeply concealed, near roads, in areas that would eventually be found. That can point to an offender balancing two competing needs: distance from the crime itself and speed. The goal may not have been the perfect concealment, but more so the removal from the initial scene. Taken together, these elements can suggest a pattern of behavior that is controlled, risk-tolerant, and focused on a specific victim type. Now, this is where restraint matters, because behavioral analysis can tell us what is common, but it cannot tell us what is certain. And in this case, there is one more layer that complicates everything, and that is the pattern itself. The matching initials, the location names, the repetition. From a psychological perspective, humans are wired to detect patterns, especially after traumatic events. Pattern recognition helps us make sense of danger. It creates the feeling that something can be understood and therefore avoided. But that same instinct can lead us to connect details that may not be connected at all. So the question becomes, are we looking for a single offender who created a pattern, or a series of crimes that were later shaped into one? That question has never been definitively answered, which means everything we've just discussed, the behavior, the victimology, the method, has to be held with that uncertainty in mind. Because even when a pattern feels clear, it doesn't always mean it was designed that way. And that uncertainty is exactly what keeps these cases open, not only legally, but in a way they're remembered and revisited. At the center of this case, there are a few things that are consistent across all three investigations. So here is what we know. We know that 3 young girls were abducted and killed in the Rochester area between 1971 and 1973. We know that each case involved a child taken during a routine moment, an errand, a short walk, or a familiar path. We know that all 3 victims were later found in nearby towns and that those locations became part of what people now recognize as the Alphabet pattern. We also know that in each case there was evidence of sexual assault and death by strangulation. We also know that despite extensive investigations, searches, tips, public appeals, and renewed for forensic efforts, no one has been definitively identified or charged in connection with these 3 crimes. And finally, we know the key pieces of evidence, particularly biological evidence in 2 of the cases, no longer exists, and it cannot be tested using modern DNA methods. This is the foundation of this case. 3 victims, a pattern that may or may not be intentional, an investigation that even with decades of attention has not reached a definitive conclusion.
And at this point, after the timelines, the pattern, the suspects, what stands out just as much as what we do know is everything we don't. Because despite the structure this case seems to have, despite how clearly it appears to line up, there are still fundamental questions that remain unanswered. We don't know if all 3 cases are definitely connected. They're grouped together, they're discussed together, but whether they are the result of the same person or even the same set of circumstances has never fully been confirmed. We don't know if the Alphabet pattern itself was intentional, whether it was something constructed or something observed after the fact. And that distinction matters, because one suggests design, the other suggests coincidence. And those are 2 very different starting points. We don't know who is responsible. There is no confirmed identity, no definitive answer. And along with that, we don't know if there was one perpetrator or more than one. We don't know the exact sequence of events in each abduction, only where each victim was last seen, and later where they were found. What happens in between remains unclear. We don't know how each victim was approached, whether they were lured or taken by force, or if those circumstances were even the same across all three cases. We don't know if the person responsible had any prior contact with them, if there was a familiarity, or if they were entirely random encounters. We don't know the level of planning involved, that whether this was something carefully constructed or something more opportunistic. And that certainly extends even to where the victims were found. We don't know if these were locations that were chosen deliberately, or if they were just simply available. We're not sure why these girls were targeted specifically. Why them? Why at those moments? And we don't know if there could be other victims or cases that were never connected because they didn't fit the pattern. We don't know how much weight investigators place on that pattern today, whether it still guides this case or complicates it. We don't know what information may have been lost over time, what details might have helped but are no longer accessible. And we don't know whether future testing, including DNA, will produce anything usable, something that could move the case forward or change how it's understood entirely. And maybe most importantly, we don't know if this case will ever have a definitive resolution. If there will ever be a moment where all of these questions are answered.
Before we close, it's important to come back to the three girls at the center of this case: Carmen Colon, Wanda Walkowicz, and Michelle Maenza. They were children. Each one taken during an ordinary moment, a short errand, a walk home, something that should have been routine. And that part of the story doesn't change, no matter how the rest is interpreted.
It's easy to get pulled into the pattern. The initials, the locations, the way everything seems to line up just enough to feel intentional. But the more you look at it, the harder it becomes to say with certainty what's actually connected and what might just look that way.
That's the tension in this case, because patterns can help, but they can also create a sense of clarity that isn't fully supported by evidence. And when that happens, it doesn't just shape how a case is investigated, it shapes how it's remembered.
So you're left with questions that don't resolve cleanly. Is this one offender or more than one? Is the pattern real or something we've built around it? And after all this time, those questions are still open.
What remains is what can be said with certainty: 3 victims, an investigation that's never reached a conclusion, and a case that continues to sit in a space between what is known and what may have never been fully answered.
And maybe that's the part that stays with you. Not just what happened, but how much of it still doesn't make sense. Thanks for listening today, guys. Like I said at the beginning, definitely go check out the Wanted Files podcast. Her podcast is super interesting, super informative, and I love the way she lays it out. Stay curious. Thanks for listening to Kat Has Questions. If you liked this episode, follow the show and share it with someone who loves a good spiral. See you next week.